Oh boy, is that what I've agreed to talk about? I'll do my best. Before we take a look at the career planning, what I'd like to run through is the dynamics of the change you were talking about before 2.0 earlier on today. And what I'd like to look at is perhaps where we have come from, where we are heading, and probably you rather than me, and also how best to prepare for it. And it's sometimes a bit like the frog in the water where the temperature is rising slowly. One talks about continuous change and so forth, but one doesn't actually realise the rate of change. So what I thought would be worth doing is just having a quick glance before we get into the real subject of the career planning. Now, let me ask you, please put your hand up. How many of you own or use a smartphone? That's pretty well 100%. That's a relief. If you lost your smartphone tomorrow and couldn't find it for 2 or 3 days, please put your hand up if that would be bad news.
What is the other option? Very bad news? Or?
Well, the other option is to lose it and say, thank goodness I got rid of it. You know, just to answer your point, a market research study in the early 90s by Motorola tested out to see, is there a market for mobile phones? And the research came back saying that we've asked lots of people working in the work environment and so on, and they say, well, I've got a telephone at home, I've got a telephone at my desk at work, what on earth would I want to have another telephone for that follows me around everywhere? And so the answer was no market, and Motorola in fact pulled back on their program. And another question, and in fact, research, psychological research recently has shown that if people do lose their mobile phone, the psychological effect is very similar to a bereavement. They actually go through the sort of Kubler-Ross cycle of being cut off from their friends, from their community, and even for older people particularly, it's also a security issue as well. So tell me, when you were born, how many of your parents sent the news to their friends by email? Hand up? Nobody. And that's only 20 odd years ago. How many put your photograph on Facebook? Nobody. So you begin to get a feeling that, wow, that world 20 years ago was actually quite a lot different to what it is today. And a lot of the things that we take for granted, and in fact can't even operate without, weren't there. So let's have a look at some of these dynamics. Now, current demographic research, and I'm not sure why I put a different slide up here. The demographic research shows that half the people born today are likely to live to the age of 100. You're sort of probably quite close to that. But that is going to be the average population age, barring obviously any major disasters, outbreaks and diseases. Retirement age. As an economist, probably Professor Edward is better equipped than I am to explain why, in fact, our retirement age is going to be increasing. In many countries, it's already 68. It's quite likely by the time you reach retirement, it's going to be at least 70, and possibly even quite a lot more, because governments, certainly over here, are breaking the news to the population very slowly, in small steps, a bit like a frog. So, when you reach the age of 70, that's going to be the year 2060. So let's do a flashback 45 years back and then have a look at 45 years forward. So if we go back 45 years, I'm sorry, should give this a look at. Perhaps we have the same slide on here.
Just extended monitor, także nie da się.
Nie da się, okay. civilization. So, that's the scenario in 1970. I'd just finished university, actually, so I remember those times. The bad news was the Beatles were just splitting up. But the job prospects were that as graduates, we expected to have jobs for life. And indeed, I still know a few people, colleagues, who retired very recently or are in the process of doing so. And indeed, they are still in the same careers as they started 45 years ago. End of salary pensions were the norm. Today, they're very much the exception. Male-dominated management. If you look at any of the photographs, you would generally find that all the middle managers, certainly the senior managers, are of the male gender. And I'll talk about the other gender in a few moments. Hierarchical organisations, extraordinarily hierarchical. A bit like the Polish organisations in 1990. But maybe I don't know how they've changed since then. Work practices were very different. Most middle and senior managers had secretaries or PAs. Most of the secretaries were female. Copy typists. Who knows what a copy typist is? Please put your hand up. Quick guess? Okay, I'll show you to define it. But would you believe back in 1970, photocopiers hadn't come out yet, or Rank Xerox were producing the very earliest ones. So if you actually wanted a document to be photocopied, and that word didn't exist, you actually had to pass it on. It went into the copy typing department, and someone would sit there for an hour or two, copying the whole thing, perhaps even getting some of it wrong. So it was a legal document, you had to go to someone else to check it out properly, and then you'd get it back maybe 1, maybe 2 days later. Doesn't quite fit today's fast-moving world. And then whilst the ladies were busy in the typing pool, here's a typical typing pool in a large organisation. So if you had, for example, a communication to send to a client or someone else you're collaborating with, you would probably handwrite, or in fact you would dictate the letter. It would then go into the typing pool, and you might be lucky to get it back the next day or perhaps the day after. And in the meantime, whilst they were busy typing, the senior managers or partners of the law firm or whatever would be spending the afternoon playing golf. That would have been the
Would they continue to do, no?
And some still do. They're the billionaires. But this was quite normal among most smallish, even legal firms or accounting firms and professionals. It would be quite normal for the partners to go off for a game of golf or something else on 1 or 2 afternoons. And of course they didn't have mobile phones chasing them, so they actually had a nice quiet game of golf, full day of golf. We look at telecommunications. That's 1970. And there was a tremendous advance. I remember it well because I had one of those ones. And you actually had to speak, hello, over, yes, out, over, and it was that sort of method. And I was one of the first people to have one of these in a car, which was a tremendous advance. And then they moved on to the smaller version of the phones. And that was a great advance when the batteries started getting a bit smaller. But that was amazing, that was stunning, because it meant that actually you could get hold of the manager on the golf course. Now, also what is happening, if we look at the advance of technology, that is the global computing power of all our devices, computers, smartphones in the world. Now, it's quite a sobering thought if you think that the average smartphone today has got more computing power than the first Apollo mission to the moon had on board. And if you look at the speed of advance, or the sort of exponential growth from 2005 through now, and the line is continuing, I have to read this bit, so please excuse me. This is an exaflop. I must admit, even though I'm a physicist, I came across it for the first time the other day. And an exaflop is a quintillion floating point operations per second. I'm sure there's some IT folk here in the room who know what I'm talking about. So it's actually 10 to the power of 18 basically calculations, basically micro calculations. But that's basically the global computing power and the rate at which it is changing. That's why it's easier to do business, it's easier for us to communicate. You can put a photo on Facebook and your friends in Australia or in Timbuktu can look at them simultaneously. It also means that your governments can track what you're doing. You know, someone at GCHQ could quite easily check all our mobile phone numbers and say, oh, these people are meeting. Should they be meeting? What are they up to? And that, of course, raises a whole host of other issues. So, as we move in this world of technology, some of the next steps are towards, so that's more of a vision of 2060, where you might be, where you will be approaching retirement. Although actually some of these do already exist. So that was on the photograph of Shanghai. But again, the predictions are that we're currently moving towards 50% of the population globally living in mega cities. And in the next 20 or 30 years, that's likely to move to 60 or 70%. And those who live in the countryside are going to be very lucky, but probably not connected quite so far. So all this technology, what is it doing? It's spurring, and already we're seeing this, but we're only seeing the beginnings of it. It's going to spur unprecedented competition, rapid access to new markets, and the good news is also rapid access to new opportunities. Ability to work anywhere with anyone at any time. That's why I felt to some extent today's panel question about what about returning to Poland? I always think that's the wrong question, because in these days national boundaries mean far less, and we should really be looking at the European market and the global market. And whether you're located in London or in Warsaw, you can still be running the same business. And in fact, I had a very quick conversation with Professor Edward after the panel, and she answered my suspicion, and that is that if you really are hitting problems and various sort of boundaries in setting up a new enterprise in Poland, a new SME or something like that, there's nothing to stop you from setting it up in London or somewhere else and operating through that legal vehicle in Poland with a branch office in Poland. There are pros and cons in terms of the Polish economy, but it would still be paying Polish taxes as well. So, but certainly there are lightweight, rapid, fast-track ways of getting there. So organisations will become more distributed, more virtual, porous and diffuse. And rather than formalised and permanent organisations with clear command structures, they will be very much more temporary structures. Collaborative swarms is one of the terms that comes through. And one sees this very much in the IT open source arena. So for example, WordPress, the website software. Who knows of WordPress? Yeah. Oh gosh, well, more than 50, 60, 70 people. So this is very much digital economy here, I can see. WordPress is an open source idea that started with only 2 or 3 people. And in fact, I'm very lucky to know the founder. He lives just outside Manchester. But his partner is in the States. And they ended up working with something like 1,000 IT people collaborating around the world on this on this open source project. All of them doing it initially not for profit. That followed afterwards. And WordPress now is the system that's used for 25% of the world's top 10 million websites. It's probably the most popular. Similar success story is, of course, Linux, the Linux operating system. But one finds similar stories in other fields and arenas as well, so it's not just in the IT field. Now, some futurologists are sort of saying, well, technology is going to continue ramping up, but the impact on our lives might actually start levelling off, because there's a limit to how many mobile phones you can use and how connected you can be and so forth. So the next stage move is what I call human 2.0. And again, looking at the workplaces of tomorrow and workspaces, I'm saying spaces rather than places, we're beginning to look at a lot of research coming through, science coming through, in terms of the human-computer interface, where sometimes we use enhancement For medical reasons, you might have an artificial arm or a limb or an artificial kidney or so forth. And the predictions are that the human being in 30 or 40 years' time will actually be wearing quite a lot of computer gadgets, some of which are mission critical for that individual, such as a pacemaker. I mean, that's already been around for quite a few years. So we're going to be seeing these performance enhancements in sports. Some are technical, others are pharmaceutical. So again, another revolution in Human 2.0 is actually the use of pharmaceuticals. I was interested speaking to one of you yesterday evening who's doing research into drug design. Sounds awful, but actually that's, I think, another major future development with designer drugs, so that they are designed to fit in and make up for problems with one's own personal DNA and so forth. The technology is going to be doing much the same. There's a recent McKinsey, sort of futurologists report, paper, talking about artificial intelligence in the boardroom. And again, looking ahead 20 or 30 years, where in fact a lot of decisions, perhaps the sort of more mechanical immediate decisions, may well be taken by robots or machines with artificial intelligence, rather than relying on human beings. I mean, you could really think of that in terms of assessment of bank loans, perhaps even assessment of applicants for jobs. A lot of this could actually eventually go across to artificial intelligence. So if you look at those guys on the right, they could be working as your assistants in your future job, or they might actually be competing for your job. So the workplace might be quite a different scenario to what it is today. Has anyone seen a film called Her? Oh, quite a few have, yes. I watched it last week. I thought it was fabulous. So I've put it up here because that's really sort of taking the whole thing of human and computer-machine interface just to the next stage. So again, a lot of these science fiction films have a horrible habit of coming true about 10 or 20 years down the line. And here we're trying to look 45 years down the line. So in the film, and apologies to those who've seen it, and I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't yet, but basically, Joachim Phoenix, the character there, is working in an agency that uses computers with artificial intelligence for writing personal letters from one individual to another. So if, for example, you've got a birthday of an aunt who lives in Australia, or it could be someone very close to you, you would go to this agency and say, I haven't seen them for 5 years, I like this, that, the other, etc. And they already know your profile, they know about the other people, and they would write a beautifully handwritten, by computer of course, letter in a different kind of paper, texture, and so forth. Because sometimes they might have another computer like that at the other end who will do a beautifully personalized letter and send it back to you. So this agency does that and nothing else. And the protagonist is then introduced to this new operating system called OS 1. And she's played by Scarlett Johansson, whose image actually doesn't appear in the film. Sorry, guys. But her beautiful, smooth, silky voice is the one that communicates with our protagonist. And first of all, she appears in the office on his computer and is there to assist him. Then afterwards, he starts using her at home. And then she says, I sense that you're not feeling very well today. Why don't you have your favourite drink? Or why don't you do so on and so forth? And over the period of the following weeks, they develop quite an intimate relationship, even to the extent that she rings him at 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone goes, and they engage sort of in pillow talk, etc. And in fact, he turns down the advances of some very nice, real physical ladies, and much prefer to go back to his OS1 operating system. Towards the end of this very intense relationship, where she's almost the OS1 is almost the only being that this person is communicating with, he suddenly asks her, do you have a relationship with anyone else by any chance? Or is there a lot of jealousy beginning to come in here? And so he said, well, I was hoping you were 16 people every day. And then he said, well, have you fallen in love with any of them? Oh yes, I'm in love with 641 of them. Now, let's hope that doesn't happen, but that just gives you a sense of where artificial intelligence might be heading. Certainly, I've seen things in the computing department lab at Lancaster University where you have systems where the image face changes depending on the tone of people's text messages or even Twitter. And that person maybe is the recipient. You can see the computer smiling or looking sad or laughing, and it's all picked up from the tone and the words that we're using all the time. So it's all in the pipeline, as they say. Now, what does all that mean for career planning? So let's get back to the main subject. Well, it's plainly obvious that we're moving forward into an uncertain world. Not that actually it's ever been certain. I mean, if you think of my parents, think of grandparents, grandparents, they think of the First World War, Second World War. So life actually hasn't really been certain for anyone anyway. But certainly the one thing that is going to be for sure is that the likelihood of any of you having the same job for life, unless perhaps in a very specific arena you're a doctor or you're a surgeon, something like that, then it's very unlikely that you'll be in the same career, perhaps a related one. I mean, I just mentioned myself. I started, I graduated in physics, and then my next career was as a director of an engineering company. Then I became a management consultant looking at organizational development, which then took me into being a government advisor in Poland for 5 or 6 years, and then a government advisor back in the UK when I came back. Then I was a director of Fujitsu, and then I became an academic. And interestingly enough, then right at the end, because my specialty was knowledge management, I had a big project for the government reviewing the nuclear power stations in the UK from a knowledge management perspective. So there the knowledge management and the government came together. But you would never guess the route. Career path. And certainly when I was graduating, I could never have predicted what I would be doing. So in how to prepare this world uncertainty, there are a number of things. One, first of all, because we were chatting over in the bar last night, a lot of people are asking about advice on how to go, what to do, what do I do with my degree, do I do a further degree, and so on and so forth. These are very difficult questions to answer. A, because nobody knows. Certainly I don't know. But also, we don't know what the externalities are going to be. But what I think is important is that you know yourself.